On the 31st of August, 1997, Princess Diana died in a car crash in Paris. Leaders from every corner of the world issued messages of condolence within hours. The American president spoke. The French interior minister spoke. Everyone spoke, except one person, the Queen of England. For 5 full days, Elizabeth said nothing at all, and that silence triggered something she had never experienced in 70 years on the throne. The anger, the fury of her own people. Newspapers openly blamed her. The crowd laying flowers outside Buckingham Palace grew larger by the day, and angrier with every hour. There wasn't even a flag flying above the palace, and people would never forget it. Today, we're telling the story of the week the monarchy was, perhaps, at its most fragile point in modern history, and of how, even in that nightmare of a week, one thing never once crossed the Queen's mind: giving up the throne. When Diana died, she was no longer, technically, a member of the royal family. She had divorced Charles in 1996 and lost her title, which meant that, under protocol, the Queen wasn't even obligated to issue an official statement. And the family, at the time, was at Balmoral Castle, the place where they always spent this part of the year, entirely out of public view. Young William and Harry learned their mother had died right there. Just hours after the crash, the Queen and her family went to church as if nothing had happened, and Diana's name was not mentioned once during that entire service. The Queen's priority was clear: protect her 2 orphaned grandsons. Keep them away from the cameras, the questions, the world's unforgiving gaze. But the people in London didn't know any of this. All they saw was that the most beloved woman in the country had died, and the Queen was nowhere to be seen. Then one tiny detail set the whole thing ablaze: the flag. The flag above Buckingham Palace was never lowered to half-mast, because under centuries-old rule, that particular flag was only ever raised when the sovereign was physically in residence, and that rule had never once been changed for any death, any mourning. But the public on the street didn't know these palace conventions. All they saw was an empty flagpole. And that empty flagpole was screaming at them that the palace didn't care. As the days passed, the sea of flowers outside the gates grew. The crowd spiraled out of control, and the numbers openly proved this crisis. According to data from the polling firm Ipsos, the Queen's personal approval rating, which had sat above 70% for decades, fell to 66% that week, the lowest point of her entire reign. Surveys found that nearly a quarter of the public, for the first time, said the monarchy should be abolished entirely, a figure that had never crossed 20% in the previous 2 decades. Newspapers ran brutal headlines. They wanted a sign from the Queen, a word, a face. Nothing came. Inside the palace, tension was rising among her advisors. On one side stood a century of rules and tradition. The Queen should not step into a state ceremony for someone no longer officially considered family. On the other side was an enormous public fury rising from the streets, one that could no longer be ignored. Interestingly enough, the person who broke this deadlock wasn't anyone from inside the palace at all. It later emerged that Prime Minister Tony Blair had personally pleaded with the Queen that week, urging her to set the rules aside and lower the flag to half-mast. One of the rare moments a prime minister told a monarch to change the tradition of her own house. The Queen herself never publicly explained this dilemma. But those close to her later said that her real concern in those days was neither royal image nor the press. She was simply trying to keep her 2 orphaned grandsons standing. Still, the pressure grew to such a point that the palace was finally forced to yield. By the 5th day, the Queen returned to London. On the evening of the 5th of September, 1997, the Queen appeared on television from Buckingham Palace and addressed the nation. The funeral was only a day away. Her speech was short, but very carefully calculated. She said, "Since last Sunday's dreadful news, we have seen, throughout Britain and around the world, an overwhelming expression of sadness at Diana's death. We have all been trying in our different ways to cope." Then she delivered the one line that changed everything. "So what I say to you now, as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart." That single word, grandmother, reframed days of silence in an instant. This wasn't indifference. This was a grandmother staying silent to protect her grandchildren. And that day, for the first time in history, the Union Jack flew at half-mast above the palace, even though the sovereign was not in residence. A century of rules had bent under the weight of 1 week of public fury. The speech shifted the public mood almost immediately. The next day, Diana was given a grand ceremonial funeral, even though she was no longer officially a member of the family. So why, under all that crushing pressure, did giving up the throne never once cross the Queen's mind? The answer lies 44 years before that nightmare week, in 1953. At her coronation, the Archbishop had asked her a single question. Was she willing to take the oath? Her answer was 2 words: "I am willing." Then came the vow itself, to govern her peoples according to their own laws. And to that, she gave her solemn word. That sacred oath had no expiry date, no retirement age, and the Queen was at the same time the head of the Church of England. This wasn't just a political title for her. It was a religious duty, a matter of faith. In the eyes of the Church, this was not a job you could set down just because you'd had a bad week or because the public was angry. In September of 1997, as fury spiraled on the streets, as the newspapers tore her apart, as even her own people debated whether the monarchy should end, the promise she had made before God 44 years earlier was still there. Unchanged, unloosened. The Queen's silence was a mistake, and she knew it herself. But behind that silence, abandoning her post was never an option, because long before that week, she had already made the one decision there was no taking back. And here lies a detail that sets Britain apart from the rest of Europe. In the Netherlands, for instance, a monarch voluntarily stepping down is almost a tradition. The last 3 Dutch monarchs each deliberately handed the throne to their children in old age. Belgium and Spain have similar examples. In other words, an aging king or queen giving up the crown is nothing unusual in Europe at all. But in Britain, aside from that one scandalous exception in 1936, monarchs stay on the throne until death. This isn't a coincidence. Like the Queen's own oath, it's a matter of a rigid tradition that ties the crown to duty through something almost sacred. So the question that should have been asked in 1997 was never really, why won't she step down? The real question was this: why does a vow that binds nowhere else in Europe quite so tightly last in Britain until a person's very last breath? That week is remembered as one of the most fragile, most dangerous moments in the modern history of the British monarchy. The numbers and statistics alone make that plain. And yet, even as public support hit its lowest point ever, even as 1 in 4 people wanted the monarchy abolished entirely, do you know the one thing that never once crossed the Queen's mind? Stepping down, resigning, giving up the crown. To her, this crisis was never a question of whether to carry on. It was a test of how to carry on in a world that was changing beneath her feet. The public's anger was real. Her silence was a serious mistake, and she admitted as much herself later. But even that mistake never once pushed her to consider stepping down from the throne, because to her, duty in a moment of crisis was never something to run from. It was something to be carried, whatever the cost. Britain turned its back on her for a week. She stayed silent, waited out the storm, and came back. And she never left again.